So why don't we begin by going around the table and we'll introduce ourselves. Okay.
Dan Brandt. Oh,
Go ahead.
Dan Brandt, Faith Organizations.
Steve Manella, Lane County Human Services.
Go ahead.
Bob Sorintz, Lane County Human Services.
Alex Dreer, Lane County staff.
Amanda Borda, Lane County staff.
Hey, Sean, you are on live and in, well, Eugene. Okay.
And I'm Chris McAllister, consumer seat, adult, former homeless.
I'm Pat Walsh. I represent business, and Sean Van Gordon is on the phone, so I'll let him.
Just wave your hand, Sean, when you want to speak.
Exactly.
And I'm Lucy Venice, Mayor of Eugene.
Hello, Mayor Venice.
Hi, coming in at the last minute. Sorry about that.
Glad you're here. Well, I want to welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. This is an executive committee meeting of the Poverty and Homelessness Board. I guess what I'd like to do before we get started is I'd like to hear from Mayor Venice about the great news that we heard last night. How that went.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes. So we, as you all know, the city and the county have worked very closely, funded a homeless services assessment and shelter feasibility study that came back, that what we call the TAC report, came back with 10 recommendations, and a implementation steering committee had met to make some recommendations about how to proceed. And the city council previously in 2018, and then had dedicated first $1 million and then added $900,000 towards a shelter and towards services. So at the council meeting yesterday, the staff presented a proposal that the council approved to put money towards a 75-bed shelter in a fast sort of modular form called a sprung shelter. Support for a strategic initiatives manager who would work with the city and the county to orchestrate that transition, support for outreach teams, support for some landlord outreach to provide some additional assistance in finding housing, and finally just an extra fund of almost $300,000 just as a contingency fund for other things that emerge where funding might be needed. So I am grateful and thrilled that we're actually now going to go to the next step, and the big challenge being finding a location for that shelter. So that's now the rate limiting step because everything else is moving forward.
Congratulations.
Yeah, feels great.
It's exciting news. Any questions for the mayor about last night?
I just want to say I felt it was a great presentation by Peter and Jason, and I'm really excited about the outreach teams. I feel like that's one of the things that League has really been supportive of. If we can't meet people where they are, we can't get them into shelter.
Right.
I'm really appreciative of that.
Yeah, that feels like a critical piece to me too.
Yeah, I too am excited. I'm excited for the next step, and I want to see that piece of property
Right.
pop up,
Right.
soon.
Right.
So that's great. Congratulations.
Yeah,
on your
thank
hard
you.
work. All right. Well, why don't we everybody have a chance to take a look at the agenda, and is there anything you want to add or delete or any questions about it? If not, let's move on to the consent agenda. And we have to approve the minutes. We also have to, consider for appointment John Raleigh Fox as our rural elected official from Coburg. And I think before we move forward on this, I'm going to ask John, do you want to say a few words? There you are.
Sure. I'd be honored to be on the board. I've been in the area for 28 years, lived in Coburg for the last 16. I was really moved last fall when I saw the encampment downtown and then have to move around. And I don't know why it took that to strike a chord, but it did. And it also harkened, I have personal experience. Unfortunately, I've never been homeless, but I grew up in New York City, and I answered the door when I was 4 years old because I was learning how to answer the door. And they foreclosed on our little place, and we lost everything. And I blame myself since I answered the door.
No.
Ended up with the dissolution of the marriage and stuff, and life went on. I no longer blame myself, but it was quite a hard myself, and 50 years later, my mother had signed a reverse mortgage and didn't keep up with taxes and didn't understand why she lost everything.
Oh,
So I have personal affiliation.
thank you for sharing your story. Appreciate it. Welcome. So with that, we can go ahead and approve the consent agenda, including John's appointment from Coburg. You'd like to make the motion?
I'd like to move that we accept the consent agenda and appoint John Rowley from the for the rural elected official seat.
Second?
Okay, great. All in favor? Aye.
Me.
Mayor Venice. Great. Great. You want to, John, do you want to come up to the table? This will be great. Welcome. Well, good. Let's move on to our next point. I want to introduce somebody, actually by name, then I'm going to let him talk about himself a little bit. Bob Surintz is joined the Human Services Division. He's working with Steve. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Sure. So I've been on the job now for 18 days and very happy to be part of this great team. I'm actually very new to Oregon by about 3 weeks, and I'm excited about the caliber of people that I'm meeting on the team in Human Services, but also in the community. And one of my first goals is to try to spend time with as many of you as I can to understand how the system works. In terms of the TAC recommendations, a lot of those fall under my hat. And so I take very seriously my role to work with you all to help create a more efficient and effective system serving people experiencing homelessness. And I've worked in the public sector since about 1999, mostly in Southern California for 4 different jurisdictions, city and county governments. And most of that time I've worked in homeless services. So I'm really happy to be a part of the team and to help you all achieve the goals that you've set before yourselves.
Great. Welcome, Bob. We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's great. Any questions for Bob? No? All right. Well, let's move on. And again, welcome. Chris, do you want to give us an update from League?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Just want to let everybody know that in the month of August, League will be opening up 4 to 5 spots, approximately, depending on how everything goes and if we get enough applicants. We really would like to invite any unhoused folks from any part of Lane County. We especially would like people from the rural community to try and get involved. We can find ways for you to be able to participate. We really need the feedback from all of Lane County, not just the Eugene-Springfield city limits. With that in mind, we also will be, in the month of September, bringing forward our state of homelessness report from League to identify some of the things that League has noticed needs to be addressed or would like to suggest as we all move forward as a community. This is separate of the TAC report and is talking about the general picture of Lane County as well. So I just really excited to work with this group of people and would really encourage anybody who feels like you have lived experience as a homeless person to any degree that you would like to see represented to please apply.
Mayor Venice.
Could you just clarify those 4 to 5 spots are car camping spots and are there?
On League, so the lived experience advisory groups, advisory spots. So
Oh.
joining our group, we are expanding. We are trying
Oh,
to get more
on League. Okay, gotcha. Got it.
Chris, how are you getting the word out on that?
We will be doing
Those spots.
PSAs. We will be putting it on the website. We will be going to meetings. If you have a homeless or former homeless group, let us come talk. We've tried to reach out in the past, and there's a lot of scheduling conflicts. Let's make this happen. I'm open myself to receive email requests if you need to have someone come speak to talk about it. Also, Amanda Borda at the Health and Human Services is our staff contact.
Okay.
Great.
Great. Any other questions for Chris? Comments? All right. If not, thanks, Chris. We appreciate the good work. Amanda, can you bring us up to speed on the continuum of care grant notice?
Sure, so I've
Funding
given
availability.
everyone a handout, the blue handout that you have in front of you. And I have some extras for the crowd. All right, so as most of you saw, I've sent out this the majority of this summary already via email, but I wanted to just kind of bring it up in case there are questions, comments, and then to talk a little bit about what the role of this group will be throughout this process over the next couple of months. And I just kind of wanted to summarize some of the things that are new or changed or different within the NOFA. So on July 3rd, HUD released our Continuum of Care Notice of Funding Availability, which starts our competition period to apply for the funds that support our Continuum of Care program, which is about 3.5 million now. 3.5 million. So total approximately 2.3 billion nationwide is available through this NOFA, including 50 million for domestic violence bonus, which was available also last year. So we'll get to that in a second. I think one of the most important things for this group to pay attention to within the NOFA is the HUD's homeless policy priorities. Each year throughout the NOFA, they sort of indicate what their priorities are for funding and for policies for continuums of care. And some of them are slightly different than previous years. A lot of times they're similar. But those are on page 5 to 6 of the NOFA. So if you can't read through the whole thing, although I recommend reading most of it if you can, but if you can't, definitely focus on that section of page 5 to 6. So those are ending homelessness for all persons, obviously. But within that one, if you really look at it, it talks about really having a comprehensive outreach strategy and making sure that we're reaching out to all persons that are experiencing homelessness and really having a system approach to that and serving those that have the highest needs and the longest episodes of homelessness. So there's a little more detail if you look in the NOFA for what they're looking for there. They also talk about creating a systemic response to homelessness. So in that one, they talk about looking at our system performance, making sure that we're really looking at exits to permanent housing, retention in permanent housing, and all of those things to make sure that our system is responsive to the issue. It also talks about strategically allocating and using resources, and here they again talk about performance outcomes, really looking at the programs that we have for cost effectiveness, performance, effectiveness, making sure that they're working, and reevaluating the inventory that we have to make sure that it's meeting the need. And then we have using evidence-based approach. So this is a new one. Previously, this was noted as using a housing first approach specifically. And HUD's not moving away from using a housing first approach, but they're sort of expanding that to say that they really want you to be using evidence, using data to make sure that the approaches that you're using are grounded in evidence-based approach. And then increasing employment is a new one. So this has been sort of within the NOFA in the past. It's one of our system performance measures is increasing income, increasing non-cash benefits. But this one sort of specifically calls it out as a priority now that we really need to be working on. Also making sure that once we get people into housing that we're working with them to increase income so that they can sustain that housing and sort of be successful there. So we have several more questions within the application itself where we have to talk about our employment strategies and how we're connecting that with our housing strategies. And then lastly, they have providing flexibility for Housing First with service participation requirements. And this is kind of an interesting one because it came a little out of nowhere. As we know, Housing First is really placing people directly into permanent housing without preconditions. And then also having really voluntary client-driven services. And this is sort of saying that we want to allow for flexibility where as one is placed into permanent housing, we can then maybe have some kind of requirement around what people participate in as far as services. And there's been a couple of opinions put out. National Alliance has said that they don't necessarily agree with this. There hasn't been a lot of evidence to say that requiring services leads to more successful outcomes. And so until we see that, I think this one is just kind of out there and we need to just think about it more and wait for more evidence to show that that's really where we should go locally. So I'll just leave that one there for now. But if someone has a question about that, let me know. Are there questions about those policy priorities before I kind of move forward?
So Amanda, the last one that you mentioned, the last bullet, you're saying that that is related to allowing folks that have requirements to participate in continuing care, because I know that nationally it's been folks that are providing substance abuse treatment that have been lobbying and have been critical about housing first being emphasized in HUD's approach, and have wanted to ensure that, recovery housing that has sobriety requirements be included as a eligible project as part of the HUD funding. And I think maybe, is that where this one's coming from now?
This one doesn't mention recovery specifically, although HUD has put out a notice previously about recovery housing
Right.
being sort of okay if you do that within a certain model.
Okay,
This one is more so saying once you've placed people into permanent housing, you can have some flexibility around, like HUD will not necessarily penalize you for having service requirements, which is
Okay.
sort of opposite of what we've had as an approach so far. So I think this one, we would just need some more information about what that means and what evidence there is to suggest that that's appropriate. So
okay.
I'll let you know if I hear anything else on that one.
I interject just
Yeah.
briefly on that. So I think the objection that some organizations may have is this sort of departs from a harm reduction model. If you're familiar with that model in health services, we have found that we're more likely to get positive outcomes if people are gradually introduced to services after they receive the assistance. And so there's some concern that this is maybe stepping back from that proven methodology of harm reduction.
That's worrisome.
That could be best helpful to offer that to save housing. Once you're in and if you have a relapse or there's things of being able to support people to connect to housing in order to save it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. Another part of Housing First that people forget is really client choice and having, goals and case plans be client-driven and sort of forcing people to participate in services that they don't find useful has not been shown to be effective, and usually people will resist that, and we don't want that to lead to people feeling like their housing is at risk if they don't participate in those services that they don't find useful. So I think there's just a lot of questions around where this came from and sort of what evidence drove this to be a policy priority.
Chris?
I feel like based on some conversations that's been had in the last couple of days, that could also be kind of entrapping, especially if we have people who are assigned or required to go to shelter based on certain conversations. And this would be very scary and possibly cause relapses and other situations if it was fully going down that extreme. So I think that as we advise in our capacity that we keep that in mind.
Go ahead, Mayor.
I would be really interested maybe in a Poverty and Homelessness Board meeting around kind of recovery strategies and recovery requirements. I attended a recovery summit, and there was some discussion about, and you will probably know much more about this, that people who are, for instance, in methadone clinics, that doesn't count as recovery, and so that it forecloses certain housing options. I think it might be helpful for us going forward to have a better understanding of that landscape,
Okay,
because it feels to me that's the missing piece for us here is,
right,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, let's get that on the agenda.
Worth that,
That's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Two, so that if people do have rules around recovery or whatever, and folks might lose their housing, that there's systems in place to help them find new housing. So like with our case managed housing, we have an agreement with clients, if you don't want case management, that's fine, but it's also our responsibility to work with you to find a different housing situation that would be appropriate. So as long as we're working together, if the case management is not for you, then we have some onus to not just give you a notice, but to say, let's find you a housing situation that works best in the transition, not to homelessness.
I think for me, what this really underscores is the need for continued education of people who aren't professionals or amateurs in this like I am. Because I think when I hear this, what I'm hearing is people reacting to, I want to make that person accountable, and there's consequences. So do you want the house or don't you? Do you want the living situation or not? And it doesn't, or not. So it doesn't work that way, as I think you guys have all just said. But I think it's really important that as we talk to people in the community, that we explain it that way, because otherwise it looks like we're just perpetuating all of these problems and not, people aren't getting well, and that's not the case. So anyway,
But I think you bring up a good point of having a session maybe on recovery housing or focusing on that.
I do too.
Potentially having some kind of strategy sessions on particular topics that maybe we find within the application that we're not as strong in, or that we have a lot of questions around in terms of how our system is working. And maybe that could be one of those topics that we need to dive into a little bit more and make sure we're addressing specifically. So I have that as a note, and we'll keep that in mind.
great, thank you.
So I don't know if I need to go into too much detail about all of this here, but just some considerations that are within the NOFA. There are a number of opportunities for sort of changing around our inventory and utilizing the new project opportunities within here. I've discussed these mostly with our RFP Evaluation HMIS Committee as the committee that kind of tackles that work for this board. And so I don't know that I need to go into detail, but we do have a bonus amount available for $175,380. We've already put out a request for expanding existing projects, which we've talked about previously with this group. And that's just due to the knowledge that we know that our current programs need additional funds to operate more effectively, and starting up new programs, we don't have a lot of capacity within our agency to sort of take that on right now, is what we're hearing. And so we felt like expanding existing projects with additional funds might be more useful. And then the DV bonus opportunity, we are also putting it out there to expand existing projects to have dedicated DV units. And so that's out there right now, and we'll see what we get. If not, we do have a standing application that we could still submit that we submitted last year, and we're sort of talking with Women's Space about revising that and whether that's still a viable application. So that will be kind of our additional option there. So that's $76,914.
That's domestic violence.
Domestic violence.
For people who may not know.
Thank you. Further considerations on the second page there. There were sometimes throughout the NOFA, the HUD will sort of adjust eligibility criteria or add additional things that are not in the regulations or statute, sort of a way to constantly add new requirements or change requirements. And so within this one, there are a couple of new things about youth serving providers. Funded through the NOFA will be able to serve unaccompanied youth aged 24 and under who have an unsafe primary nighttime residence and no safe alternative to that residence, and they don't need to have the third-party documentation of literal homelessness. So I think this is in response to the YHDP application, the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program application that has recently been put out in the last couple of years. One of the big barriers for youth is that they don't necessarily meet that definition of literal homelessness because they couch surf or they stay somewhere temporarily that may not be safe but isn't exactly fitting the definition that we normally use. So this is a nice little bit of flexibility that could help us serve additional youth within our community. And then HUD also clarified that persons who are fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking may qualify as homeless under paragraph 4, which talks about serving those who are experiencing domestic violence or fleeing domestic violence. So that's also a nice addition to clarify that they could qualify there. So the big process here is the COC ranking, and that also happens through that RFP Eval HMIS committee. So that's the group where we've been really discussing that in detail. The Tier 1 and Tier 2 process will continue to prioritize our projects, and so that will happen through that committee. And I've summarized the amounts there for you in that chart. And then the COC application itself, I've just summarized the scoring. The majority of points is in system performance. Again, that has increased, as well as performance and strategic planning. So the two largest areas both involve performance, both on our, our system outcomes metrics, but also on how our system is strategically working to end homelessness for chronic veterans, individuals and families and youth, so particular populations and how we're responding to that. I imagine through this application we'll talk a lot about the TAC recommendations and the system recommendations that we're moving forward and those strategies and how those will impact those metrics. So that's going to be the bulk of our application. And then finally on the back you'll see just a couple of actions that will be taken from this board. So like I said, approval of the new projects process, that will happen through the RFP Eval HMIS committee, but we'll bring those final decisions to this group as well. And then approval of the ranking will happen through that committee, and then final approval needs to happen through this committee at the next meeting. And approval of our submission of the application itself. So we will have a draft, I don't think, prior to this board meeting, but we will send out and post our final draft for review, and then there's a time to comment or provide edits if needed, so. So look out for a couple of things at the next meeting, and it's scheduled for the normal time, but we'll see if we have enough people. We'll need enough people for quorum, so.
And can we verify that number? How many people do we need to have here for that to pass?
I don't know.
8 or 9.
Thank you.
So if
And we
not,
will
we'll
have a
need to-
call-in option, so the next meeting, it's an August meeting when usually we recess for August, but we will be meeting the third Thursday of the month in Bascom-Tykeson rooms, catty corner to where we are right now, at our normal time, and there'll be a call-in option.
Thank you.
Questions?
I may have missed it, Amanda. Normally, we've had a subcommittee that did the ranking.
Yeah, so that will be the RFP Eval HMIS committee. That's the group that does the ranking.
Okay, all right.
Great.
But it will come to this group for final approval.
Any other questions or comments for Amanda? If not, thank you very much. Appreciate your work on that. All right, governance and strategic planning, at the last full board meeting, we had a pretty robust conversation about strategic plan and moving forward and what that might look like in terms of aligning with the TAC and other initiatives that are happening. So I'm going to kick this over to Steve to kind of lead us through this.
Okay, and I'll introduce the strategic planning piece and then turn it over to Alex to talk about some recommendations. And I know this is something that Sean had talked to us about too, so I don't know, you may want an opportunity remotely to comment on this, but essentially, we've had a discussion about what it is that we need to do in relationship to updating the current strategic plan. The current strategic plan goes through 2021, so what we'll be doing is updating the current strategic plan. We've also had a lot of discussion about integrating the recommendations from the Technical Assistance Collaborative, the TAC group, and then the items that the City of Eugene and Lane County have adopted as part of our work plan. So those are sort of some of the things that we know, and so the conversation that I've had with Alex and with Sean, and then with the chairs, the chair and vice chair of the committee, have been what is the kind of process that we want to use to do our planning update? Who do we want to involve? How do we solicit information from our work groups or subcommittees? And so I'll turn it over to Alex to talk about that, and then I think what I'll do is talk about the governance issue as a separate issue, even though that needs to be involved in the strategic planning.
Thank you, Steve. So as Steve said, the Poverty and Homelessness Board Strategic Plan, which is on our website, lanecounty.org/PHB, it goes from 2016 to 2021, and we treat that as a living document that can be amended as we see fit, as things have changed significantly since 2016 when it was adopted. Many facets of the PHB have changed since April 2016 when it was adopted, including committee structure and membership. The PHB Strategic Planning Committee meets as needed and most recently met on April 19th, 2019 in order to discuss updating the plan. The Strategic Planning Committee recommends updating the existing strategic plan and incorporating elements from subcommittee work plans. At this time, there are 10 subcommittees, work groups, or ad hoc groups of the Poverty and Homelessness Board, and more than half of them have their own specific work plan. So integrating what each committee or work group is working on into the overall plan is what is recommended by the Strategic Planning Committee. So I came up with a few options for how to engage in the strategic planning process so that it involves the voices of and the work of all our subcommittees and board members. These options are for you to review. They can be added on to one another, and then I solicit your feedback for how to structure the next strategic planning meeting and those conversations so it can be effective. So one option that we have discussed is to request 2 to 3 overarching strategy recommendations from each subcommittee or work group, and then those recommendations would be considered for addition or updating the existing strategic plan. Another option is to invite a representative from each subcommittee to the strategic planning meeting to revise and update the strategic plan, which would ensure that any revisions incorporate subcommittee voices and priorities.
Okay, so what we're looking for maybe is some comments on those first two things. I think the other piece, and Sean, are you still on the phone?
Yes, I am.
Okay, yeah, so the other thing that we discussed was, what kind of a process do we want? Last time, we hired somebody to facilitate the process. We broke out into different areas that are the goal areas for the strategic plan. We did the thing of people putting dots up and priorities. And I think the conversation that I had with Sean was maybe a different kind of process this time. And so, Sean, do you want to share what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I would be happy to share what my thoughts are. My thought was, based on the conversation in the last full board meeting, is that instead of sort of focusing on the process, meaning the dots and having a facilitator, that we more structure it about having in-depth conversations about the problems that we're facing, and then let the staff sort of come away and work on the language from that point of view. So they would take away the language and kind of craft the language itself and bring it back to us. I'm not sure that dots are, from a process perspective, are going to get us where we need to this time around. But when I listen to the rest of the board, there's a lot of lively discussion about what needs to get done and some of those problems that we still face. We need to trigger that conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mayor, if you're going to say it.
Sean, I think that makes a lot of sense. The dots seem not helpful this time, and especially given that we have subcommittees that have their own strategic plans, that really, people have done a deep dive into some of these areas already. We don't really need to weigh in. This is an update. This is not a new plan, and so it feels to me that this most seamless way we can incorporate those strategic plans into our overall plan is what we're after. And,
Chris?
Of the committees that I'm on, most of the goals and strategic plans have been pulled from within the strategic plan itself. So they're not, a lot of them aren't even just out of the framing, they're built to the framing. It's just they haven't been necessarily at the forefront because of our trying to make the overarching Operation 600 goals. So.
right.
No, and I agree. We don't need to go back to the dots. And I think that truly the last all PHB meeting we had, when we discussed this, we probably had, I think, one of the most robust discussions that we've had yet in terms of our group, and to discuss the hurdles we're crossing and also what those hurdles look like. So I'm absolutely in your corner, and Mayor and Sean and believe, and Chris, that we need to make this more informally formal, or formal and formally, than what it was previously.
So a couple of questions would be, one is, so I think it's sort of a no-brainer to have, each of the work plans from the subgroups that we have, and then also to give those subgroups an opportunity to say if they had, up to 3 strategies that they're working on that they'd like to see reflected in the strategic plan, what those would be as a process. And then the question is who should be in the room, and something else we haven't touched on is sort of the public input to the process, how we want to handle that. Last time when we met over in Springfield, we had chairs around, when we did it in little subgroups, we had chairs where people could come and observe the conversation. I don't know if we want to handle that a little bit differently this time, and also have an opportunity for the public to weigh in.
Chris?
I can certainly appreciate that. I'd like to make sure that we try and maybe consider a couple focus groups for unhoused folks and people who are facing poverty in order to help supplement just the general public, because we have a lot of providers, we have a lot of engaged people, but we have a lot of people who know what their needs are. They know what's not happening. And a second question is, does this update allow us to revisit some of the timelines we have, so such as the expanding to 40 safe parking places which are within government property? We still have 20 vacancies that have not been assigned. Does updating that or putting pressure on that count as a general idea, or does that count as just housework and we still get to do the 3 ideas?
Well, it seems to me that it would be, we have to figure out why these things haven't happened and then get them done.
So I see what Chris is up to here. He wants to have for his group maybe more than 3. So I would say that.
Adjusting the record, sir, to be fair.
No.
But what I would say is, I think what I was referring to, my intent was to say, up to 3 new strategies. I think the other thing that we've done with the Strategic Planning Committee is we met and we sort of color-coded, is this one green we made progress on, and what is that progress? Is it yellow? We've sort of initiated something and we're still in process, and what that is, or is it red? Is it something that we had as a strategy and we haven't made any movement on? And I think it's for the subcommittees to review that and to have that information going into the strategic planning session, and then to say, like, if we had a specific timeline that we wanted to do it in, and I can't remember how much specificity there was around timelines for specific strategies, but I think those things coming forward too, sort of the sense of the group of, if the strategic plan goes through 2021 and let's say it's from the healthcare group and it's a healthcare strategy, is it something we should do this next year or the following year, or how do you see that progressing out? So that we have a sense of if this is a strategy, either an existing or a new strategy, when do you see it happening within the balance of this strategic planning period, and why do you feel that that's important? So we can take that into consideration, because we have a lot of items that dovetail with the TAC report, but then we have things like particularly with the healthcare committee, and then we have things that are related to what I would call alternative shelter, and so we have items like those that aren't part of the TAC architecture that we need to consider and need to figure out how they fit in with our plan.
Hey, Pat.
Yes.
And I think there's 2 kind of important things in that. One of them is, especially since Springfield's got its own set of strategies, right? Like, there's going to be more than just the tax strategies in that strategic plan. And I want to make sure we're sort of clear on that piece. And the other piece is that I think we need to go through and look at all those strategies that get turned in and just do a logic check to make sure that they're sort of pointed at the big goal, right? Like, we could have, we could put everything in the world in there, or we might want to either do a point, or just provide some feedback and going, okay, this is really helping us to get to our end goal. There's more strategies that necessarily going to help. Sometimes it's focus.
Right. Well, I think you raised a good point, Sean, and I think it's important for this group and all others to be inclusive of the Springfield priorities that sometimes we're not always aware of, but that's good. I do think it's important that if every group is going to come up with 3 strategies, we're not doing 30 strategies, or we're all going to need that session that you talked about on resilience and rehabilitation. But that's just me. So I think that setting some expectations will be important. And for my money, and I think probably everybody else's, I think focus is going to be the key, because we have to start getting some traction on some things, but we've also got to do better than that.
Well, and just to follow on that, I mean, the timeline is already established for
Yeah.
us because this is a strategic plan that culminates in 2021. So we were really only wanting to look at how are we going to further our objectives by 2021. And some of that conversation is just foreshadowing what the next strategic plan might look like. We say, well, we're going to do this piece because in the next 5-year plan, we're going to look at the next iteration of it. So
On to the next.
it's a way of containing it a little bit.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to reaffirm that while we respect everybody having their own different strategies, we also have to account for the people who are not considered in those strategies. There are no places for singles and couples with direct services for the majority of Springfield. So their strategies are sent to Eugene, sent to Lane County, and let Health and Human Services sort it out. If we're going to update this type of stuff, we need to make sure that we are accounting for them instead of assuming that we're taking care of Eugene people. We're taking care of these other groups of people when our homeless need services where they're at, even if it means the county's bringing them to us. We need to have that factored in because our people are not being counted.
Understood.
Thank you.
Understood.
I just have I have sort of more or less have it in my head what the strategic plan looks like, but there is a difference between strategy and tactics. And so I guess, I mean, that feels to me like a pretty important distinction when we're at this level, that we're really talking about strategies.
Strategies.
We're not digging down into
Right.
specific tactics.
Right.
That's right.
I was just going to add, Pat, that it reminded me of a conversation that Sean and I had after a recent, I think, league meeting, where we were talking about process improvement. And it sounds to me that's what you are really wrestling with in terms of your strategic plan. How do you move this forward? And I'm thinking about folks I've recently met in our department who that's their job, right? Process improvement. And it sounds like really what you're wrestling with is how do you identify and prioritize these strategies. I have a hunch that we may have some resources, although I don't want to make someone put more work on their plate, but we do have some resources in our department, and I understand Steve Mokrahysky also has a vision for process improvement. So rather than having like an outside facilitator, we might be able to find some of those resources. But again, it's not my place to tell people what to do. But I just think that in terms of process improvement, that's really what you're after, especially in the last 2 years.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's exactly it. And as the new guy, you can volunteer anybody for anything and not be so you're in good shape.
Steve will talk to me afterwards.
No. So go for it. But all kidding aside, I think you've just summed it up. I think what we've been reaching for in all of our conversations, what you just said, it's really to improve the process and to stay at a high enough level that we're not getting into the weeds of the tactics that most of us can't individually take on. So that's a good suggestion. Is that a next step for us? Is for you guys to identify if there's somebody internally that can help lead us through this process improvement system?
Yes.
Okay. And in terms of other next steps, how do you see us moving, group, how do you see us moving forward? Sean, do you have a suggestion? Sean is gone.
No, not gone. I just was thinking of something brilliant to say. And
Well. Take your time.
He's in an airport.
You're in an airport. Okay. Well, great. Maybe that's our first step. And maybe if Alex and Steve and maybe some of the rest of us, we can come back with a plan to present to the board in terms of how we'd like to see that session go. That'd probably be the best next step.
Okay, great.
hey, Pat.
Yes.
As long long as the outcome is as lively and as engaged as what it was at the board meeting, I think we'll do a great job.
Yeah, I think so too. I came away from that really, more enthusiastic than I have been and pretty charged up. So I was glad that we had that level of conversation. That's for sure. Thank you. Anything else? All right. Dan.
So let me finish up then on the
Governance?
On governance. So this was the other conversation we had at the last board meeting, and I think part of where this is coming from is in thinking about what we've been talking about with implementation of TAC recommendations, working with Springfield and other considerations. That one of the things that it makes sense to do in the next 6 months is to look at the governance structure.
Okay.
When we formed the Poverty and Homelessness Board, one of the questions that we had was, should this be an intergovernmental board rather than a county board, so that there is some authority for whoever's appointed to this board or the executive committee from the jurisdictions who then goes back, that it's not sort of seen as, well, they're attending a county advisory committee. So that's one of the questions for consideration. And then the other piece that has been sort of an eye-opener as we've worked on what we've been calling the TAC implementation, that we're going to come up with better language for, is that it's very helpful to have the major organizations that are represented on this board, the county and the two cities, and I don't know about representation from LCOG as a rural, but to have the organizations that are going to be asked to help implement things locally, to have a representative at the table. The one thing that's been very helpful with our TAC work has been having the city manager and the county administrator or their designee. So one of the considerations might be to have on the executive committee of the PHB a representative of the city managers and the county administrator, so that when we're trying to actualize our strategies, we have legislative, community, nonprofit, and organizational buy-in. Sometimes we can sit around and dream up a lot of good ideas, and if we can't get the buy-in of our organizations, then we're not able to implement the ideas. So that's just a thought. So this is all just food for thought, and to say that, as an executive committee, we should plan on scheduling a session at a later date, to talk about this, and then and perhaps invite either Steve and John or their designees to come and talk about that with the executive committee.
I think that's a good idea. I'd also like to see an additional person who was unhoused or is unhoused participate.
Yeah.
I think
we have a vacancy right now on our both our full board and our executive committee.
But I think we need that input. I think is equally or more valuable at times than some of the rest of it. So, just my own opinion. Chris.
Yes, sir, and I certainly appreciate that idea. And if we do expand into this new type of form of government, I suggest, to tie into what our chair just said, to have more lived experience, not just the homeless, but also rural poverty, rural seats. We need a couple more lived experience seats that aren't necessarily homeless driven if it's going to be an intergovernmental agency. If it's going to be simply homeless only, then we need to really focus on whether or not we're the homeless board or we're the homeless and the poverty board. So if we're going to be an intergovernmental thing, that's just my thoughts on the fly, having just heard this.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else? John, Sean? Good?
Me, Sean, or Sean?
No, no. I'm looking across the phone at both of you, hoping one of you see me. Yeah, no. Either you, Sean? Sean in the back, Sean on the phone.
I don't feel the eye contact bad. I'm good.
Okay, all right, good, all right. Well, that sounds good, Steve.
Okay.
That'll be a good session, and thanks for giving that some thought. I'm going to kick it over to Dan Bryant to talk about the bond measure and housing revenue.
So our strategic plan calls for 600 additional units in affordable housing. And the TAC plan calls for 350 units of permanent supportive housing. And it's always a question of how are we going to get to those numbers? And so I was intrigued when a community member made this suggestion at a county commissioners meeting, and I took his information and expanded it a little bit, changed it, made it my own. And just would like to put on the table this consideration if, as part of our strategic planning, we should be endorsing the concept of a bond measure, county bond measure. And I don't know if the figures are right, but just to get us started with the conversation. We're all aware of the need, and just two facts here: the increase of $200 in average rent in this area here in the last year, and that renters at the 20% at the bottom of income pay more than 60% of their income on housing, which of course is not sustainable. So what can we do about that? So the suggestion of a $50 million bond, again, a county bond, which translates to 9 cents per $1,000 of value. It would be countywide. You can have a mixture of rural, urban, private, public. The nice thing about doing something on the county level is that you have a lot more flexibility than you do with state or HUD dollars. What can we create with that? Well, if they were family housing of 2, 3, 4 bedroom, we know from the latest project that St. Vinny's just announced on River Road, it's $251,000 per unit. If it were housing tiny homes for singles and couples, small households of 1 and 2 people, Emerald Village was done for less than $80,000 per unit. So take those two, and by the way, anytime you do tax financed housing, tax credit financed housing, it's more expensive. So I'm extrapolating a little that that $251,000 figure for the River Road project could be done for less if we're not having to do tax credit financing, that there are some cost savings there. So we could get to that $250,000 per unit figure, create 100 units for $25 million, and tiny homes, yeah, if we had to go all the way up to 100,000, 250 units, so magically there's 350 units for $50 million. And the other advantage is that doing something like this, we would be able to use that financing to leverage the state money that's coming down the pike, recently approved by the legislature to have even more projects. One little interesting fact from various economic studies: every dollar you spend in housing generates $350 in return, in terms of, that dollar goes around in terms of economic activity in the community. So how would we go about doing this? We would need a committee of folk, and whether it be Poverty and Homeless Board or some other committee, to begin strategizing to working towards that. I think obviously you would not want to have a bond measure on the ballot the same time that the county puts out another bond measure for the county courthouse. It's just not wise strategy to do two at once, and so we need to figure that out and working with the county in timeline. But if we could do it in May of 2020, that would be ideal. I don't know, that'd be pretty ambitious to put it together that quickly. And of course, you would need to have a number of public hearings around the county to present the concept and get input from different areas in terms of what could be done in that area with such a project. So I just wanted to put that on the table because I thought it was a great concept, and I think it falls under our purview to consider something like this to promote.
Steve?
So I will sort of bring you up to date with, I've been given a staff assignment to work with a team of county people. This was brought to the Board of County Commissioners last week, I believe on Tuesday. And so the board has asked for a work session. And the work session, it's just an exploratory work session, but the tack that I'm taking in approaching this is that I've made contact with folks at Metro, which is the, Metro is a government, a governmental entity that represents Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington County. It operates a number of services regionally up in the Tri-County area, and they were successful in a major bonding effort. They also coordinate with the City of Portland. They have a oversight committee for both the City of Portland and the Metro bonds because they're trying to work collaboratively on them. So the intent is to get some folks from up north to come, and I don't know if that's going to be in August or September, you know, to come and do a work session to say, you know, this is what we did, this is how we came up with the language we did on the ballot measures, this is how we came up with the framework, because, you know, there's a framework of a mix of housing for homeless people and people who are 30% or below median income, and then other types of low-income worker housing. So they sort of put together a policy framework that gets to both the people who might need supportive housing or have lower income, very low incomes, and then other folks who are among the working poor. And so that's sort of the approach that I'm taking, and then the you know, the county board will need to decide you know, what direction they want to give to the administrator and to the organization in going any further on this. So, but I know Carl Eisenbach is the name of the gentleman, and I know that he has, he made the presentation to the Board of Commissioners. He also visited with me, and he's visited with a number of folks. And so the other aspect to this that counties and staff can't get involved in is, you know, anytime that something's put on the ballot, there's usually a political action committee or folks who organize in the community. And I think Dan, specifically as a county advisory board, you know, Dan asked me the question, you know, can the advisory board take a position? And I, you know, I think that it's appropriate for this group as an advisory board to take a position on such a measure. And then the other thing that seems like a no-brainer is that again, it's the thing we talked about earlier, is just the alignment and looking at this conversation of, you know, the mix of types of housing. Dan has on here tiny units, family units. We have some people in the community that are working on modular. There may be, and Commissioner Joe Burney from Springfield, he has some ideas about maybe how this bonding could be leveraged even more to create more housing. There's some ideas around, you know, could some of the bonding be used as a revolving loan fund, you know, for some smaller folks who are home builders to be able to capitalize projects for low to moderate income people that wouldn't get built otherwise that would be available, so.
Hey, Pat.
Yes.
Or Steve.
Yeah.
Well, I know it's really early, and I just want to put out that, like, I'm still really curious, but, like, I think we just have to urge a little bit of caution here as it sort of plays out and to see what it is. Obviously, the Board of County Commissioners taking something up and making that policy decisions, obviously the first step, but, you know, I also have a lot of concerns that come out of it from everything from every jurisdiction is asking people for money right now, and the bill from staying home that's going to hit people's pocketbook is going to be much bigger this year, right? So I've got a lot of people in Springfield that own homes that are really going to be skittish about, because they're barely making it and their tax bill never goes down. So I'm like, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, right? Especially with just familiarizing communities with what's happening and what's being asked and getting a good story together. But there's going to be a lot of concern out there.
Agreed. Chris?
Thank you. I think that if we're going to do something like this, there has to be teeth in it. And by that, this is the teeth for the property owners and the business owners, because they want to see stuff that's happening. So if we invest in the TAC implementation strategies of outreach, doing the navigation right now, then we'd be able to show that these services will help move people into these houses that are built. Right now, I think without any strong showing of what we're doing now and right now, like what we're doing with the people who are downtown, what we're doing with the RVs who still do not have a place after a year, the people with dogs who have not had a place for 2 years and now are no longer having a place at dawn to dawn, which is now no longer dawn to dawn, it's dusk till dawn. Or services are getting smaller. We're helping the people who have the most amount of services in our community and not helping the people who have no amount of services in this community. And so the people I know who own land are not going to be happy with this unless they see some kind of service outreach now to make it worthwhile. So with that in mind, like, this is a great thing, and if we had a declaration of emergency that had teeth, that empowered a levy that has teeth, then we might have teeth. And we might be able to get a bite on this instead of constantly moving it down and raising prices and then blaming the homeless people for not meeting program needs that don't meet the need of the community. And so these houses are going to be great, but we have we have unused vouchers because they don't apply for the buildings that are vacant. So building houses is only one part of the problem. Putting people in houses is only one part of the problem. And I'm not seeing the social network coalesce. We need less rods and sticks and more carrots for people to actually get to where they need to be. Right now, we're just beating people down, and then whether it's raising the rents or raising the taxes. My rent went up $200. What are we supposed to do? Taxes go up every year. The metropolitan, the utility rates are going up. People can't afford to keep on being nickel and dime. And people go, oh, it's only 0.09. Yeah, it all adds up. And nickel and dime people who have the least, the fixed incomes, that ain't gonna fix this. How do we fix this where it's responsible, where it's progressive and actually progresses to progress? This is cool, this is great. I had the opportunity to go after Carl and speak about the fact that we are still not able to place sick, dying people right now. People say, take it to the carport camping program. They don't qualify. These people won't get into those houses either until we change how we think and do things. And we as a body can actually advocate for that. This body here can actually be that voice. But we listen to what the state tells us to do. We listen to what the feds tell us to do. And then we listen to what the greater community who already solved their problems do. We need to listen to people who actually know what they need. This is my thought, but I yield on this.
Thanks, Chris.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think those are pretty valuable insights on this. I would love to see this happen, and so it could be that it's a matter of timing. There's not just the conflict with the courthouse bond measure. It could be the rollout of the TAC recommendations, more progress on the ground where we do the landlord outreach, we do some of these other things, so we clearly are creating a more effective pipeline. And so it may just be that this is part of the information groundwork we do about how to do this, and it becomes part of that larger conversation. I mean, the city also created a construction excise tax. It's just rolling in now, so we're hoping that there's going to be some city funds so maybe there's some other options in addition to a bond or instead of a bond. So I hear you. I think it's challenging to sort of, you want to do the research and build the understanding, and that doesn't mean you're going to jump on it right away, but it does mean you're going to get that information, and that feels valuable to me, to know the lay of the land a little bit and hear what the County Board of Commissioners said. I do just want to make a comment that in terms of this body being able to weigh in or endorse, if you have someone from the city manager's office and county administration sitting on this body, then you're going to close that door.
Okay.
Because there'll be staff. So as we talk about governance,
Okay.
Would you clarify that a little bit more? Is it if they're a voting member that makes that kick in? So, but if they're ex officio, does that still?
I'd have to have someone who knows more about the legal issues. But I just think we should explore that as we're thinking about governance. We should be really clear about that, about what.
We have staff here now,
We have staff here now.
but they're not voting.
But we haven't taken a stand, and they could make it more. I'm just knowing from my experience with things that we've referred to the ballot.
Right.
Staff don't participate in that.
Sure.
The city council does that completely independently.
Right.
And so once you have staff involved, I'm not sure what.
Well, I think you bring up a good point, which may be that what we want is to make sure that we have staff from the county administrator's office, city manager's office involved with the PHB rather than them being appointed to the committee. So the distinction being that they're not a voting member, but it's part of how we structure, how we move things forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just had a question, because we just had a debate at City Council the other night. Can the elected officials endorse a bond measure? Okay.
Yeah.
Because they're sitting on this.
Yeah, I mean, elected officials, you're free to jump into politics. You're in it. It's just different if you're staff.
You're paid.
Yeah.
So,
Just to give a little context, I was looking at the City of Eugene's housing needs assessment from 2012 to 2032, and in that period of, 20 years? Some 15,105 units are needed to address the need for the housing stock. About 55% of that single-family and 45% of that multifamily. So when we think about this bond, even if what it would accomplish, there's still a long way to go.
Right. Well, that's the global picture.
Right.
Not necessarily targeted at the people in poverty.
So we probably ought to talk about what next steps are for this. Do we need to, we're gonna hear from,
Yeah, you'll hear, I'll continue to update you as the county gets involved in getting more information. Another thing is that I do think that, part of this conversation needs to be, also looking at other funding mechanisms, because one of the things in discussion with Carl on this and just in knowing about this in practice is that we know with supportive housing and homeless kinds of things, there are three different pieces. There's the construction, the capital costs, there's the operating costs, and then there are the services. If, for example, we're building units of housing for folks with severe and persistent mental illness, then you want to have services available for the people in the housing, and there's and then the operating, like with MLK Commons, we have a partnership with Homes for Good, the housing authority, and they're providing the Section 8 certificates, which pay for most of the operating costs. So there are other, there's a whole piece around housing finance and considering some of those other other pieces as we're looking at a bonding program, because the bonding program really just pays for the capital program.
Right.
So that's another, that's another thing that complicates this discussion and requires some forethought in how you approach it, so.
That's good advice. Chris?
Mr. Chair, I understand that the county's borrowing rate went up this week or something along those lines. Could that be something that could help for the market rate housing type building, whereas we focus our public dollars, and that be kind of one of our strategies?
I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think what it does, though, is that it, on any kind of bonding issue or financing that the county has, it puts us in a better position to get financing, given the rating that we have from Moody's.
Thank you.
And I like what you said, Steve, about, finding some other funding sources. I mean, what Chris talked about, we are beholden to the people that provide us the money to do things the way they want it done, but to find some other resources would probably be good too.
Yeah, another compelling thing that Dan mentioned on this, I think, is the fact that, the state of Oregon, the legislature has just put out, they have just approved a healthy budget, $50 million for supportive housing, millions of dollars for affordable housing, and so on. And, one of the things that Carl did is that he brought forward, he was trying to calculate if we were able to get, at least 10, at a minimum, at least 10% of all that money that the legislature had allocated, how much that would be, and the fact that maybe if we had a local source for gap financing, that we could couple state resources with county resources and leverage this even further. And otherwise, and that's one of the considerations on timing, is otherwise we, at least for this biennium, we might not be as successful at getting all the resources if we don't have as much local cash available.
Dan?
So we are an advisory board to the county commissioners.
Right, that's how
And
you currently
I
structure.
would just suggest that it would be appropriate for us to put on the August agenda,
Okay.
this issue, to ask the board to advise the county commissioners. And to say, it is our advice that the county should seriously consider, a bond measure and at least investigate it, to do all the exploration and, and just encourage our commissioners to proceed and to take a good, deep, hard look at it.
Sounds good.
May we have discussion at that general meeting for an actual robust discussion on that topic? Because I feel like Homes for Good and Shelter Care, or not Shelter Care, but St. Benny's and other people of our board might have some input in that conversation, instead of just signing off on it.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Is there anything else? The crew here? If not, I did not have anybody sign up to speak. Is there anybody in the crowd that'd like to come up and talk? Sure.
No, monthly,
Monthly.
yeah.
Okay. Well, if not, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.